All right. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Hello. My name is Yusuf Sahurla. I'm an undergrad at Stanford studying history, and this year I am the inaugural Abbasi Markaz Fellow. The Abbasi Markaz Fellowship was a new initiative launched this year in collaboration with the Markaz Resource Center and the Abbasi Program in Islamic Studies. The fellowship focus is to allow a student to engage in Islamic scholarship by working with faculty and scholars from different backgrounds and curate events centered around Islam in different historical and cultural contexts. For our final event of this year, I wanted to highlight a region that has a rich and deep history in Islam, yet is widely unrecognized in the public sphere of Muslim discourse. That region is Eastern Europe, with countries such as Bosnia and Herzegovina and Albania. The perception of Muslims in America is widely dominated by Arabs and South Asians, but there's immense value in showcasing the diversity in the Muslim community, especially in America. I also want to start by quickly apologizing to everyone. This event was supposed to happen a few weeks ago, but our team on our end ran into some unforeseen circumstances. We unfortunately had to postpone. But we're super grateful to have Dr. Sinanovic here with us and to be able to have the event now. With that being said, to showcase what this event wants to do, I'm excited today to welcome Dr. Sinanovic to join us in the conversation. Dr. Sinanovic is a political scientist and a scholar of Islam with a passion for studying the comparative politics of Muslim societies. He grew up in Bosnia and Herzegovina, which was then part of Yugoslavia. He has lived in Croatia, Malaysia, and the United States. Currently, he's the executive director of the Center for Islam in the Contemporary World at Shenandoah University, where he is also a scholar in residence. He has a Master of Arts and a PhD in political science from Syracuse University. And before coming to the US, he obtained 2 bachelors, one in the Quran and Sunnah, and one in political science from the International Islamic University of Malaysia, as well as a master's degree in Islamic civilization from the International Institute of Islamic Thought and Civilization in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. Dr. Sinanovic is fluent in English, Arabic, Malay, and Bosnian, and his research is on transnational Islamic revival, Islamist activism, politics of Southeast Asia, contemporary Islamic thought, and institutionalization of Islam in the Balkans and Southeast Asia. So inshallah, for this event, for the next hour or so, Dr. Sinanovic will start us out with a short 15-minute lecture on sort of Muslim history in Eastern Europe. Then we will jump into a series of moderated question and answer that I have prepared. And then at the end, we'll open it up for audience question and answer. And for the audience Q&A, what we'll have folks do is you can either direct message me a question and I will relay it to Dr. Sinanovic, or please use the raise hand feature on Zoom, and I can call on you then to have you ask a question to Dr. Sinanovic. With that being said, if everyone can please remain muted for the duration of the meeting unless asked to speak. And then without further ado, I'd like to welcome Dr. Sinanovic.
Thank you so much, Yusuf, for this wonderful introduction. Good evening, everybody. Good afternoon. Assalamu alaikum. Good morning, depending on where you are in the world. It's a great honor to be here and to be invited. And I would like to thank the Abbasi program in Islamic Studies at Stanford, as well as the Center for Russian, East European, Eurasian Studies and the Markaz Resource Center at Stanford as well, for making this event possible and for inviting me. As Yusuf said, we will begin with about a 15-minute presentation that's going to contain a little bit of history, a little bit of analysis, just to sort of get everybody up to speed on Islam in Eastern Europe. And I'm going to use a PowerPoint for that. And please forgive me if I go through some of the points very quickly. We don't have time to go and spend the time explaining every point, but if something catches your eye, if something sounds interesting to you or something is unclear, please hold that for later during the Q&A. I'd be very happy to address whatever the questions you might have. So let me just make my PowerPoint available, and I think we will begin. Could you please just let me know if you can see my screen now?
Yep, we can see it.
Okay, wonderful. So once again, my name is Sinanovic. I'm with the Center for Islam in the Contemporary World at Shenandoah University, Virginia. The picture that you see on the right is from the central square of the old town in Sarajevo. It's a picture I took. It's a larger picture. It looks actually quite beautiful. It was in the morning, and it had a beautiful sky with the mosque. And I think it sort of captures a little bit of the landscape of Bosnia. So I'm going to talk about Islam in Eastern Europe, but I'll also preface this by saying that the focus is going to be on the Balkans and also to some extent on Bosnia and Herzegovina, because these are the areas that I know the best. So those are the areas I'm going to spend more time talking about. So this lecture is called Untapped History. And I want to ask this question. I would agree with the basic premise of this subtitle of the lecture, that this is an untapped history, that Islam in Eastern Europe is often neglected or minimized in the study of Islam in Europe in general. And I do not know if this is an intentional neglect or just a blind spot in scholarship, but it also points to, I think, a larger problem that we often have in the study, in global studies, and that is something that I would call neglected geographies. Oftentimes, when we mention a certain area or region, we actually think a particular sub-region within that larger region. So a lot of times when people talk about Europe or Islam in Europe, they actually think of Islam in Western Europe. And for that reason, Islam in Eastern or Southeastern Europe is often neglected and sometimes completely forgotten in the study of Islam, for instance, in Europe. The same could apply to Asia. Oftentimes in the United States, especially when people mention Asia, they usually have in their mind China, Japan, Korea. Rarely do they think places like Afghanistan or Pakistan or even Iran, which geographically are in Asia. I'll give you just a brief anecdote. I remember when I was a student in Malaysia and I used to watch the news, and they would say, and now the news from West Asia, and they would start talking about what we call here the Middle East. But for people from Southeast Asia, that is West Asia. So it also points to the reference points that we use, the kind of lenses through which we view the world. And I think that is important to bring into consideration when we talk about Islam in Europe as well. And so this untapped history and these neglected geographies point to a larger issue. And at the Center for Islam in the Contemporary World, where I'm the executive director, we have a program called Islam on the Edges. And Islam on the Edges seeks to highlight Islam in the areas that are often neglected in the study of Islam. Oftentimes, again, when people talk about Islam globally, they tend to focus primarily on the Middle East, North Africa, to some extent, Central and South Asia. But a lot of other places around the world get neglected or completely forgotten when it comes to the study of Islam. My understanding is that Islam on the Edges is Islam full of dynamism, uniqueness, innovativeness, and adaptation. And this methodological approach to the study of Islam, I think, could be applied to a number of things. What is really interesting about this approach is that it's both polycentric and non-centric in nature. And what I mean by that is that it invites us to think of multiple essential centers of Muslim culture and religious experience that are equally important and constitutive what makes Islam a global presence. In its polycentric nature, Islam on the Edges imparts a non-centric understanding of the Muslim religion. No center or region is more critical to understanding global Islam than another. This sort of methodological intervention is, I think, needed presently in the study of global Islam. And I'm very grateful that the Abbasi program at Stanford University recognized this and that they invited me to speak about Islam in Eastern Europe, because I strongly believe that this belongs to this genre of Islam on the edges. Of course, Islam on the edges has in itself built its own demise. If it ever becomes accepted as a methodological program, there will be no need to talk about the edges any longer. But in the meantime, we're going to have to speak of that. I'll give you several examples of neglect, but I could cite many more. What you have here is, for instance, content of a couple of books on Islam in Europe. So, for instance, here you have on the left side, Islam in France, Islam in Germany, Islam in the United Kingdom, Islam in Europe, as if Islam only exists in Western Europe and nowhere else. Likewise, a recent study on Islamic intellectual history in Europe talks about voices of European Islam, and it covers several thinkers that are listed here, all of whom are immigrants in Europe or descendants of recent immigrants in Western Europe. And when the book talks about voices of European Islam, it does not talk about Islam in Eastern Europe, Muslims in Eastern Europe who are native populations of Europe and who have been around for many, many, many centuries. On the right side, you have a Pew Research Center survey that talks about Muslims in Europe. And you can see even from the map that much of Muslims or countries in Eastern Europe are left out of this survey. Now, one could make a point that this was a survey of Muslims in European Union, but in that case, the survey should have stated that, and not to say in Europe, but then leave out several countries where actually there are many, many Muslims in areas. So let's cover the basic demographics. So this is collected or compiled from this book. It is called Yearbook of Muslims in Europe, that is published annually by Brill. This is volume 13, and the volume 14 should be coming out in a few months. I'm one of the contributors to this book. And based on the statistics and demographics, I have compiled this table that shows Muslim population in Eastern Europe. Now, even if you look at different maps of what Eastern Europe is, you will see some of the countries are included and some are left. Some of the countries that are sometimes classified in Central Europe, like Hungary or even Poland or Czech Republic, in some other classifications appear in Eastern Europe. In other words, these names and these designations are not set in stone. Be that as it may, here is a number of countries that I think most people would agree belong to Eastern Europe. And a few things pop out from this. Number one, there are 3 countries with Muslim majority in Eastern Europe: Kosovo, Albania, and Bosnia and Herzegovina. Each of these countries has relatively small population, so the number of Muslims in those countries is not very large. For instance, there are more Muslims in France there are in Albania, Bosnia and Herzegovina, and Kosovo combined. But what is important here to understand is, number one, that these are majorities in these countries, and number two, that these Muslim populations have been around for centuries. The largest Muslim population in a single country in Eastern Europe is that of Russia, if we include Russia. And you know, there is a strong case for Russia to be included in Eastern Europe. About 14 to 20 million, according to different estimates, which can mean anywhere between 10 to 13, 14% of the Russian population is Muslim. In other words, Russia has more Muslims than all of these other countries on this list combined. In some countries have significant Muslim minority, like North Macedonia, about 1/3 of the population is Muslim. Bulgaria has about 10% Muslims, Montenegro almost 20%, Russia about 10%. And then in the rest of these countries, the percentage of Muslims is relatively low, in many cases below 1%, around 1 and below 1% of the population. So this gives you a sort of an overview, a synopsis, if you will, of the Muslim presence in Eastern Europe. Okay, when it comes to Islam in Eastern Europe, there are certain shared characteristics. One characteristic is that we're talking about minority context. Most of these countries that I've listed, Muslims are a very small minority. Even in countries where Muslims are majority, like Kosovo and Bosnia and Herzegovina, they've only become majority in these countries fairly recently. That is to say, when these countries became independent countries. Both Kosovo and Bosnia were part of former Yugoslavia. Then after the first breakup of former Yugoslavia in the 1990s, Kosovo was part of Serbia, and then in 2008, it proclaimed its independence from Serbia. So even though in these countries, Muslims constitute majority, there is a strong legacy of a minority complex, if you will, of a minority interaction with the larger community and larger society around it. The second shared characteristic of all these countries is secularism. Muslims in each of these countries have been exposed to secularism, which in most of these countries actually was a very aggressive type of secularism, which is connected to the point number 3, or the shared characteristic number 3, is that all of the countries that I've listed in Eastern Europe have at one point been socialist or communist countries. And as a result, most of these countries applied very aggressive forms of secularism that was very anti-religious in its tenor, in its orientation. And for that reason, the Muslims in these lands developed a certain way of dealing with the secular state and a certain way of protecting their identity against the very aggressive influence of the secular state in those places. The fourth shared characteristic is the Ottoman heritage. While it is not equally present in all of the countries of Eastern Europe, the Ottoman heritage in many of these countries directly influenced Islam, because in the Balkans countries, the countries that were directly under the Ottoman rule, but even the countries that were not occupied or conquered by the Ottomans, the Ottomans left a huge imprint on those countries. And finally, final shared characteristic is that in each of these countries, Muslims have had a very close contact with Christianity, mostly the Orthodox Christianity, but in some countries, of course, Catholicism is the majority form of Christianity that is practiced in those countries. To the left, of course, you have a picture of famous Hagia Sophia, which was a Byzantine church converted to a mosque under the Ottomans, then converted to a museum under the Turkish Republic, and most recently converted again to the mosque under the current government led by President Erdogan of Turkey. So what are some of the relevant issues? And again, I'm just giving you a broad overview in whatever few minutes I have left. How many more minutes I have left, Yusuf?
Honestly, Professor, you take as much time as you'd like, and then we can adjust with the question and answer. I think, we all want to hear and learn from you. So please take as much time as you need.
All right, thank you. But I'm still going to be mindful of that. So one of the relevant issues when it comes to the Muslims of Eastern Europe is migration, whether it be forced or willing migration. From the 19th century onward, when many of the countries of Eastern Europe started their own, developing their own nationalist identity, self-determination, in many areas, fighting for their independence against the Ottomans, in other areas due to the Ottoman wars with different countries, such as, for instance, Russia, the result was that many of the Muslims living in these areas have moved around. Starting with the Greek War of Independence in 1821, after the Crimean War in the 1850s. And then, of course, what we have after that, Russia occupying the Crimean area, which until then was probably majority Muslim. And then over time Russians have become majority in Crimea. And of course, we all know that very recently Russia annexed Crimea that preceded the current war in Ukraine. From Caucasus, or Kavkaz as it is known, Imam Shamil led resistance against Russians. He was finally defeated in 1859. And as a result, many of the Muslims in those areas, such as Chechnya or Ingushetia, were killed or had to leave those places. And then from the Balkans, after the Turco-Russian War, 1877-78, that resulted in the Berlin Congress, which ceded some of the Balkans territories to other European countries, including Bosnia, for instance, that from which the Ottomans retreated in 1878 and then came under the occupation and influence of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Justin McCarthy, professor at the University of Louisville, estimated that during that century, that about 100 years, about 5.5 million Muslims have died, and about 5 million became refugees and moved around, either from one area of Eastern Europe to another, but most of the time migrating to the Ottoman lands and later on to the Turkish Republic. So we're talking about a huge migration of people, huge. This, of course, it needs to be said that also millions of Christians perished in these wars, and unfortunately, that century created not only resulted in a huge number of casualties, but also created even deeper animosity between especially Eastern Orthodox Christians and the Ottomans that to some extent continue until today. What are some of the other relevant issues? So for the Muslims who were living in the Ottoman Empire, after the Ottomans lost their territories, the question became for the Muslims, should they continue living in those lands? The classical Muslim jurists held that the vast majority, that Muslims should not live under a non-Muslim rule. This makes sense in the context of pre-modern societies. There were no liberal constitutions that guaranteed freedom of religion, freedom, all kinds of different freedoms that we have in democratic societies today. And so it made sense that they pronounced such rulings. As a result, many of the Muslims, as I already mentioned, migrated into the Muslim majority lands, while others eventually justified staying and living under a non-Muslim rule and becoming a minority or a political minority. Even though in many instances they were a demographic minority, they now became a political minority. They also, with the development of the constitutional government, had to find a way to live under the constitutions, whether those be monarchical arrangements and constitutional arrangements or different type of secular states, including especially after the fall of communism, for instance, and transitions to democracy, living in a democratic state. All of these required Muslims to look at their own religion and heritage and try to make sense of it and try to find a way how they can accommodate it within the broader political constitutional framework that they now belong to. And then, of course, we have modern ideologies, of which socialism and communism in general were most devastating to religion in general, not just Islam, but Christianity and other religions. Mostly Christianity and Islam were prevalent in parts of Eastern Europe where communism and socialism were prevalent. And that also resulted in certain ways of accommodation, and I cannot go into examples, but I'll be willing to engage with this question later on. When it comes to culture, I'm going to highlight this one aspect of it. The late Professor Fikret Karčić, who was one of the leading scholars of Islamic constitutionalism and Islamic reform in former Yugoslavia, he passed away just a few months ago. He wrote about something called Islamic tradition of Bosniaks. And he said that, and Bosniaks are Bosnian Muslims, right? The people who are native Bosnians who have accepted Islamic religion. And he said that there are 6 characteristics of their Islamic tradition. They are Sunni Muslims, they belong to Ottoman Islamic culture, they continue some of the pre-Ottoman practices, but have Islamized them over time. they have a tradition in modern times of Islamic reformism, which is known as Islah. They have a certain way of institutionalization of Islam, and they practice Islam in a secular state. Each of those could be broken down and explained in more detail, but I think for this particular purpose, this is enough to give you an understanding of how that long-standing tradition impacts culture and how culture will interact within that sphere, because that can tell us something about the presence of Muslims, for instance, in other European countries or here in the United States, and how over time those traditions could be more molded to sort of synthesize between the existing practices and certain religious requirements. Another important aspect of Islam in Eastern Europe is education, and we can see that especially in the case of the madrasas. Madrasas were Islamic religious schools that gave education to Muslim clerics, for the lack of a better word, imams, prayer leaders, scholars. The oldest such madrasa or Islamic school is the Ghazi Khusraw Beg Madrasa in Sarajevo, which was established in 1531. On the left, you have in the Arabic script is the Waqfnama, which is the endowment letter, basically, that establishes the trust or the deed, if you will, that establishes the madrasa and the whole compound around the madrasa and the mosque. In 1887, under the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the College for Sharia Judges was established, because even under the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which was majority Catholic empire, the Muslims still had certain level of autonomy, and the Sharia law was applied for the Muslims in personal matters. So when today people talk about, for instance, Sharia in Europe, Islamic law, if you will, or Islamic jurisprudence, and how foreign it is, they forget that more than 100 years ago, there was a Christian empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, that actually accommodated the Sharia law within its own confines, within its own constitutional arrangements. Not only that, but it built the College for Sharia Judges so that they can administer Islamic law within the Austro-Hungarian state. And in 1977, under communism, this is very interesting, and again, I'm not going to talk into details, the Faculty of Islamic Theology was established in Sarajevo. Now it is called the Faculty of Islamic Studies. Since 2004, it has been absorbed into the University of Sarajevo as one of its faculties or units or colleges, as we would call them in the United States. And then when it comes to cultural expressions, there are many of these. For instance, the presence of religious songs, sometimes nasheeds called, or qasidas, or ilahiyas, as they are known, are well present due to the Sufi heritage that exists in much of the Eastern Europe. One particular example of cultural religious expression I wanted to highlight is what is known as female or muqabala, which is known as recitation of the Quran in the month of Ramadan. Probably many of you know that in the month of Ramadan, the Muslims recite the Quran and try to complete the whole reading in the month. In Bosnia, for instance, there are several mosques where women gather to recite the Quran. It would be only for women. Would be women leaders would recite the Quran. This is to be separated from the regular 5 daily prayers, which usually women do not lead, and in Bosnia, it's usually not the practice that would happen. But this is a religious practice of recitation of the Quran. So they would have these gatherings for women, many, many others to talk about. And in the podcast that I have with George Mason University called On the Edges, I actually have an episode on female piety in Bosnia and Herzegovina, where you can talk to two Bosnian Muslim women, and they talk quite a bit about the, in my opinion, very interesting conversation. So with that being concluded, and Yusuf, I might have taken longer time than you probably wanted me, but I think even with this, it's just a cursory overview. I think when we talk about that history, about the contributions that we can derive from expanding our gaze and our view of the world and different regions that we look at. By looking at Eastern Europe, we can understand relevance for contemporary Muslims, but we can also talk about importance for the West and its relationship with Muslims. And as we can see, there are a lot of precedents that exist in Eastern European Muslim history that can inform current presence and maybe reduce some of the tensions that exist in some of the Western European and Western societies in general when it comes to the issue of Islam and Muslims. So with that being said, that's pretty much my presentation. Again, sorry I took longer than I was allocated, but I hope you found this interesting. I'll be very happy to engage in a conversation and to entertain your questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sinanovic. Just real quick, can you still hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, good, because I think my headphones died or something. But thank you so much. That was, such an excellent lecture. I learned a lot. What we'll do now is I have some questions prepared. So it'll take maybe about 20 minutes for that moderated Q&A, and then potentially another 10, 15, depending on your availability, Professor, for another for audience question and answer. But with that being said, thank you for such a great talk. I know I'm probably speaking for everyone in that I learned a lot. I think, when I was thinking of the title for this talk in Untapped History, it is genuinely that, where I grew up in a community where I did have a lot of Bosnians at my mosque, at my masjid, but you never really learned about that history of Islam, and sort of, I always found it very important to learn about. So my first question for you, and actually your last slide leads into it perfectly, where you were discussing sort of what sort of this conversation means for Muslims in the West and for the West in general, and sort of making that conversation more broad. My question is, how can conversations regarding the cultural and ethnic identity of Muslims in America expand to include those of Eastern Europe? Because, in my perception of, how we talk about Islam, in a Western context, in an American context, we, like I mentioned at the beginning, I think a lot of Americans probably perceive Islam to be Arab or South Asian. So in a weird way, it sort of neglects both, Eastern Europe, which is a level of whiteness, as well as, I had an event earlier this year about sort of African-American Muslims and African-American Islam. So it also neglects a lot of Blackness in the Muslim space. And so how can Eastern European Muslims, as well as, you also have a lot of research and studies in Southeast Asian Muslims, how can these other sort of minority groups within Islam come more to the forefront of sort of that conversation?
Yeah, that's a great question to start with, and it goes back to both the beginning as well as the end of my presentation, which is that we need some kind of methodological reorientation when we think about global Islam and global Muslims, right? So it's not just about a certain well-defined categories, but I think we need to expand our methodological view into those edges that I talked about and try to put them under the spotlight and bring them to the center and try to understand that. I can give you numerous examples and anecdotes. I still remember after 9/11, there was a lot of issues with Muslims being stopped at the airport, singled out for, security screenings and things like that. And I remember maybe a few years after 9/11, I was in Malaysia actually, and talking to some of my Muslim friends. They asked me, how is it, over there in America, we hear all these stories about discrimination and, Muslims being singled out for this and that. Have you ever experienced any of that? And I said, I've heard many stories. I have friends to whom this has happened, but this has never happened to me. And one of my friends said, but that's because you're white. And I really never thought of that before, but, my name doesn't sound recognizably Muslim. And so that in and of itself shows to certain, dynamics that we have both within the larger society here in the United States, but also within the Muslim community. Part of the issue with, for instance, Islam in Eastern Europe and in the Balkans is that because of their historical experience, those communities have become quite insular. And so that even here in the United States, you do not find many Muslims from the Balkans participating in the wider community activities in the Muslim community, for instance. If you go to even major conventions like ISNA, ICNA, and others, you will not find many Bosnian Muslims or many Albanian Muslims, even though there are many in the United States. And that means the sort of way of how their own experience has informed them to become much more insular, but also in the way that maybe they see themselves more part of a wider society here than of a particularly just a Muslim community. So there are all these different levels of identity that can be mentioned here. The other part of your question, and there are many different layers, but I will just answer one more thing. So because I want to keep our conversation going, is that when you look at many of the debates that Muslims in the West have today, for instance, on halal food in the military or in the prison system and so on, these debates were happening in the Balkans or in Eastern Europe 150 years ago. And there are fatwa, that is to say religious rulings on these issues, issued by the local Muslim scholars in Bosnia and in different places that have addressed these things. One of the big issues was that when the Ottomans left and the Austro-Hungarian Empire came to Bosnia, and Muslims were conscripted into the Austro-Hungarian army, military, the question is, should fight in this army? We're Muslims, this is majority Christian army. What if they attack a Muslim country? Which is exactly the same kind of debate that Muslim Americans have had in, for instance, 2003, during the invasion of Iraq, or in 2001, during the invasion of Afghanistan, right? So what if a Muslim is fighting in the US military and goes to Afghanistan and is required to kill another Muslim? Theologically, a huge problem. How does it get negotiated against the requirements of the nation state and the loyalty that the nation state demands? These are all multiple layers. They are not exclusive to Muslims. Other religious communities discuss these issues too, But I wanted to highlight that many of these issues had been discussed in the Balkans and in Eastern Europe by the native European Muslim communities 50, 80, 100, 120, 150 years ago almost, So there is a lot of heritage there to be learned. I think what is needed is the translation of these works that are often written in vernacular languages and are not accessible to a lot of people out there. To read, for instance, these legal opinions, to see to what extent are they relevant, what kind of argumentation was used, and to what extent is this relevant for us today.
Gotcha. Thank you. Yeah, that's an excellent explanation. It goes beyond just sort of how we, on a very surface level, perceive and read it in America. Like you said, there's a lot of layers that affect even, life outside of America, life outside of, Muslim spaces. You mentioned something that led me to another question that I have, where you mentioned that, a lot of the Eastern European Muslims in America, whether they're Bosnian or Albanian, they don't go to ISNA convention, or they don't go to ICNA convention, or they aren't involved. And you mentioned that they have sort of that insular mentality to them. I wanted to touch on, something a bit more serious, because it just reminded me a little bit of this. This past year, the Abbasi program's theme for their events and programming was heritage, memory, and cultural production. And when we were talking about the Balkans, the most symbolic event that captures sort of that generational pain and trauma is, of course, Srebrenica, right? Srebrenica. What are some of the ways that collective memory of that genocide have sort of shaped Muslim identity, both in Eastern Europe and in America, and how that has sort of potentially led it to be sort of this thing that, you know, isn't as discussed.
Yeah, the genocide in Srebrenica, which was recognized, you know, in the judgments of the International Court for former Yugoslavia in The Hague, International Tribunal for former Yugoslavia in The Hague, in multiple judgments against some of the Bosnian Serb military leaders and political leaders, is really a culmination of a long-standing acts of, you could call them ethnic cleansing or so on, against the Muslim of the Balkans that go all the way back to the Balkan Wars for hundreds of years. There were massacres that happened in history that are of greater magnitude than even Srebrenica. But Srebrenica was really a culmination of a long-standing process in which the Muslims of the Balkans were seen as a foreign entity, even though they were native to the land. But because of the association with the Ottoman Empire, they are seen as simply not belonging to that part of Europe. And so you have a situation where many of the territories where Muslims previously lived have been completely, you know, for lack of a better word, and I don't like to use the word cleansing because, you know, it sort of implies that these people are somehow like a dirt and they needed to be cleansed and removed. But this ethnic removal and genocide that has happened, that has eliminated multiple Muslim communities in Southeastern Europe and the whole of the Balkans. There are many areas and territories where Muslims were lived, where there were many mosques and madrasas and schools, and there is absolutely no Muslim presence today. This is the case even in Bosnia today, where in half of Bosnia that is under the control, you know, 49% territory today is under the Republika Srpska, which is one of the two entities in Bosnia and Herzegovina. And before the war, Muslims were about 40 to 45% of that population of that territory. Now they're less than 10%, not even that. So basically their cultural heritage, their presence over there has been almost completely erased. And so even though they constitute more than 50% of the population overall in Bosnia, they are heavily concentrated in only half of the territory, which is basically where they had to be in order to survive the onslaught that happened in the early 1990s. So this is not something that happened, you know, we talk about 1800s or 1700s and so on. This is something that happened fairly recently under the watchful eye of the so-called international community, you know, with the CNN and other international networks present, and those of us who are old enough remember this in the news, just like Ukraine is in the news right now, you know, and but that doesn't stop the aggressors from doing what they do. And, you know, just like Eastern Ukraine may be completely Russified, if you will, the much of Bosnia has been completely, you know, devoid of Muslims today. And so Srebrenica is a very important event that should be a symbol, I think, of the both suffering of Muslims, not just in Bosnia and Herzegovina, but in the whole region. But it should also be a point of resilience, because it shows that Muslims are there, that they are part of the land, that they've been around for many centuries, and that by recognizing this particular event, they are trying to retain their own heritage and their own memory alive.
Gotcha. Yeah, I really like that last bit about being a point of resilience and keeping that heritage alive. Because one thing that I learned from your lecture was Eastern Europe region has a very long history of Islamic intellectualism. That's another thing that, you know, in a very surface level, you learn about in America, about this deep, rich history of Islamic intellectualism in the Middle East, right? Like with Baghdad being the center of Islamic thought. But, you know, there was the madrasa in Sarajevo in 1531. So we're obviously familiar with that scholarly tradition in the Middle East. How is there that similar level of intense spiritual and scholarly tradition in Eastern Europe that's been present? And it sounds like there is, and how can we bring that more to the forefront? Why isn't that, at least in perhaps Western spaces, not as much in the conversation as many of the, Arab philosophers or the Arab schools of thought?
Well, I mean, keep in mind, this is still a relatively small population. So their level of cultural and educational production is not going to be at the level of area countries where Muslim population was much, much larger, that had bigger centers of learning. Having said that, in history, we have a number of prominent scholars that came to Bosnia, many of whom studied in different intellectual centers in Istanbul, in Cairo, and in other places. And they wrote their works in Arabic, in the Ottoman Turkish, in Persian, and in Bosnian. So for a scholarly class of that period during the Ottoman times, they were usually quadrilingual, right? They would speak their own Bosnian language. They would obviously learn and write in Arabic because, it is the language of the Quran or the lingua franca of the Muslims. Then you have the Ottoman Turkish, which was the administrative language, but it was also a scholarly language. And then there was Persian, which was usually mostly used for poetry. and Persian poetry was very popular in the Ottoman Empire and Persian poetry was often memorized, used, and even written by the people in the Ottoman Empire. So we have works in those languages coming from those eras. If you go, for instance, to Gazi Khusrav Library, which is adjacent to the madrasa, to the school, you'll find many of the manuscripts. Actually, the oldest manuscript there, to my knowledge, is the manuscript of Ihya Ulumuddin, which was a famous work, a revival of religious sciences by Imam al-Ghazali, one of the great Muslim scholars who passed away in 1111. And this manuscript was actually written during the Ghazali's lifetime, while he was still alive. And that manuscript is available in the library in Sarajevo. And there are many, many other classical manuscripts, both that were authored by people from outside Bosnia, but also people who originated from the Balkans or Bosnian region. So today you have several madrasas in Bosnia, not only one. There are also faculties of Islamic, what they call them Islamic pedagogy, that is used for training the teachers who are teaching Islamic religion in schools. And then there is faculty of Islamic studies that offers bachelor's, master's, and PhDs in Islamic studies, where you have a great number of scholars. So probably when it comes to the whole of Europe, you probably have the greatest concentration of Islamic scholars in one place would probably be in Bosnia and in Sarajevo, because you have so many prominent religious scholars who had studied both in Bosnia, but many of them also got degrees from reputable universities in the Muslim world as well. And every year, many of these madrasas produce imams, and they produce hufaz, or as they know, the people who memorize the whole Quran. I think just last year, probably more than 100, they said, the hufaz of the Quran were produced in Bosnia, and actually majority of them were women. And so another important aspect of that tradition. And I could go on, but keep it at that.
Oh, thank you so much. That explains a lot, because that's something that, while I've been an undergrad, become more and more interested in, is that sort of deep Islamic intellectual history. And, we tend to focus a lot on scholars like Ghazali and whatnot, but it's good to hear about the extensive scholarship in other regions as well. Professor, the last question that I have for you before we switch over to audience Q&A is more of like a modern question, I guess, more of an advice or wisdom question, especially for young Muslims. So it's like, how can young Muslims in America be more cognizant of including ethnic groups such as, Bosnian Muslims or Eastern European Muslims in America in the Muslim community here beyond an academic space. So whether that's in our college MSAs or in conventions like ISNA or ICNA, or in our masjids and mosques across the country, how can we be more mindful of that?
Yeah, I think there must be a deliberate, conscious effort to try to do that. I myself had, with my involvement in Bosnian community here in the United States, have tried to encourage them to participate in these wider fora or forums. Largely unsuccessful in that effort, I must say. It's not easy because there's certain, because of the fact that, for instance, the Muslims of the Balkans have been cut off the rest of the Muslims for too long. And then because of the fact that they lived in secular and also in the second part of the 20th century, socialist and communist societies and countries, they developed certain affinities. I'll give you an example. When the war in Bosnia started in 1992, the aggression by Serbia and the Bosnian Serbs against the nascent state of Bosnia and Herzegovina, some of the Bosnians became refugees in Pakistan, for instance. But very after, they basically all decided to leave Pakistan and migrate to Western Europe, because for them, Western Europe was culturally closer to them than, for instance, Pakistan. In other words, their European secular identity was stronger than their Muslim identity, if you will. And that's just one such example, but there are a few others. And almost every time, if Bosnians are asked during the war, where would you like to migrate if you had to leave your home? Pretty much everybody wanted to go to Western Europe or America or Australia. Not simply because these are more affluent societies, but also because they felt certain cultural affinity. They felt that they can integrate themselves better in those societies than if they go to places like Pakistan or Bangladesh or Iran or Turkey even. So that's an interesting point. And that also translates to what we see here in the United States. Because of pronounced cultural differences, I think a lot of Balkan Muslims and Eastern European Muslims do not find themselves comfortable existing within those spaces that we just mentioned, like Islamic and so on. And so how that can be done is $1 million question. I, as of yet, have not found the answer to it. Trying. But that's a really good one. And I think it's something that maybe at the level of these communities could also be deliberated, so that maybe some way of common ground could be found, and that these communities could also become part of the wider conversation.
Yeah, inshallah, that's something I hope for as well. Because like I said, growing up in my community, I'm from Illinois, and my Muslim community for much of my life, it was very Arab or very South Asian, very Desi. But I was always cognizant of both the Eastern European Muslim population that was there. I had Bosnian friends growing up, as well as the Black Muslim population there as well. And both of those groups sort of feeling this exclusion from these predominantly Arab or South Asian Muslim spaces. So again, just making that conversation bigger and broader. Thank you, Professor. So Professor Sinanovic is gracious enough to let us go past the time a little bit, hopefully maybe another, it's 6 minutes to 7 Pacific time. So hopefully we'll be done by 7:10, 7:15, but I wanted to open it up to audience question and answer. So if anyone has a question, they're welcome to use the raise hand feature on Zoom, and I will try to call on you in the best order, or you can private message me a question as well, and that I can read it aloud. So anyone is welcome to do that. I received a question from an audience member earlier that I'll go ahead and read. But if anyone else has any questions, feel free to message me or use the raise hand feature, and I will call on you in that order. But I have a question from Philip, who asks for Professor Sinanovic, what was the term used for theology in the title of the faculty founded in Sarajevo in 1977? and why was it changed / what was it changed to in 2004? In other words, Philip is curious if there are terms in Bosnian that are analogous to ilahiyat in Turkish or theology in English, or are there other terms referring to usul al-adin, religious thought in general, etc.?
Thank you so much. The question coming from my friend Phil Durrell. He, based on the content, he's the only one who would ask that question. So yeah, no, actually it was Fakultet Islamske Teologie. So it's literally Faculty of Islamic Theology. It's not, the word ilahiyat was not used there. So it's a very sort of Slavicized, Western style description of the faculty. Why it was changed, I didn't know exactly the process because I wasn't involved there, so I wouldn't know. My hunch is that they wanted to indicate that this is not just about theology, because theology has certain specific connotation, especially within European context. So if you're a theologian, that's all you do. Whereas if you do Islamic studies, then it's kind of broader. It includes psychology and sociology, and it can include political science. It can include history, right? Whereas when you say theology, that is more in line with sort of traditional understanding, maybe like Ilm al-Kalam or something like that. But, and I don't think that ilahiyat, as it was used in Turkey, is influential here, because the people who created Faculty of Islamic Theology were more influenced by the Azhari reformism, where Azhar refers to Al-Azhar University in Cairo, the kind of reformism of Muhammad Abduh, who later on Mahmoud Shaltut, and so on, because some of the people who started Faculty of Islamic Theology in Sarajevo in 1977 were actually students in Cairo during the times of Shaltut and other reformist-minded, reform-oriented shuyukh in Egypt. So I think probably the influence there comes much more from Egypt than it comes from Turkey. And so ilahiyat would not necessarily be a factor here, and it's a different type of connotation. I hope that answers your question to an extent, and then it's a wider conversation. But I think a trip is in order to Bosnia, so that we should send you on a trip there, and you can ask all those questions and study that for yourself and make a good comparison with the ilahiyat faculties in Turkey. That'd be great.
Thank you, Professor. Yeah, Philip, I hope that answers your question. Feel free for a follow-up. I'm not seeing any others in the chat or any hands on Zoom. Is there anyone have a question for Professor Sinanovic at this time? Otherwise, I might have a couple more I could ask, but I do want to give some time for the audience.
Yeah. Am I that intimidating?
Okay, so I have one question from Cassie from the Markaz. She'd be interested to hear more about the adaptations Muslims living in these secular countries made with their cultural / religious practices over the years.
Yeah. So these things never happen at night, right? Usually, sometimes people are impatient when it comes to these things. When will Muslims or whoever it is, when they will become just like this or just like that? Think of, for instance, Irish or Italian immigration into the United States, or even Jewish immigration into the United States. It took generations for them to find a way to accommodate their own heritage, religion, and the prevalent society in which they resided. So in the case of the Irish and Italians, that would predominantly be Catholicism, which was different from the predominant Protestantism in the United States, and obviously for the Jewish community, it's a totally different religion. So that never happens overnight. Societies do not form that way. Cultures do not adapt overnight, unless, of course, there is a complete dictate from the top saying from today you have to do this or else, And this has happened, for instance, in the Soviet Union, in some of the other communist countries of Eastern Europe. Sometimes the change was very abrupt and enforced by the state. So I remember my mother told me when she was growing up, this is post-World War II, she said we used to have these religious lessons in the mosque. And then one day they just came and said, from today, there'll be no religious lessons. So for like 13 years, these were completely prohibited. You could not teach religion. The only way you could do that is the privacy of your home and secretly, because if anybody finds that you're teaching religion to children, they could report you to the authorities, and the communists could put you in jail or punish you in whatever way. After probably 13 years, that started loosening up a little bit again, but by then the culture was already changed somewhat. So it's a really mixture of things. Sometimes government imposed and mandated, sometimes the community itself adapts to the wider environment. So there's all kinds of different things that happen there in that negotiating process. So that would be kind of general dynamics, how this happens. And there are many different examples of that. So even, for instance, after the World War II, until the time, the practice of covering the face was quite widespread in Bosnia, for instance, especially in urban areas. The kind of thing that we saw in Afghanistan under the Taliban was not unknown. We're talking about Europe, mid-20th century, right? The communist government said Muslim women have to unveil, and they cannot wear that any longer. And overnight, that changed. Similar thing happened in Iran, for instance, under the Shah during his modernization efforts. In Afghanistan under the communists, which then explains also how, when the Taliban came and the Mujahideen and the whole kind of, every time somebody pushes envelope in one direction to the extreme, you're bound to a decade, 2 or 3 later to see somebody pushing it to the other extreme. This has happened in several societies. And so we've even seen in the 1990s in Bosnia, with the coming of the Salafi ideas, which is a kind of more austere version of the Islam, that you have the return of the face veil in Bosnia, which was completely eradicated during the communist time. In the 1990s, you start seeing it again. Very, very small percentage, very few women have adopted it, but it is not unknown the way it was in 1992. So, societies adapt in different directions depending on how much freedom people have, how involved the government is, how imposing the government is, and how willing people are to negotiate their own cultural and religious norms. And there is no easy way to quantify that, but these are the kind of dynamics that happen. And I think this is not peculiar to Muslims. It happens in every community, in every cultural community, in every religious community all around the world. We've seen dramatic transformations one way or the other that had happened in the last few centuries, especially with the onset of modernity and nation state.
Thank you, Professor. And thank you, Cassie, for a great question. Any other questions from the audience? Yes, Dr. Farah.
Yes, thank you so much, Professor Sinanovic, for this wonderful talk. I learned so much, and I think all of us here in the audience feel the same way. I had a question for you about sort of Sufism in Eastern Europe. You commented a little bit on the Islamic intellectual tradition from, the 1500s or so. Was there tied to those madrasas any sort of Sufi zawaya or certain orders that were more prominent in these parts than other places? You mentioned Imam Shamil, for example, who's a Naqshbandi sheikh who was also involved in resistance to sort of the Russian communist invasion. So do you feel like Sufis were present also in the Balkans? Did they also play a role in political resistance to communism in any way?
A great question. So yes, the Sufis were definitely present, continue to be present in the Balkans also, although today their presence and influence is smaller than it used to be in the past, because during the communist time, the Sufi orders were pretty much decimated, in a similar way that, for instance, in the Turkish Republic under Kemalism, the Sufi orders were also banned. So the Naqshbandis that you mentioned, the Refais, Qadiris, they're all present in Bosnia. Also the Bektashis, not so much in Bosnia, even though they are, but in Kosovo and Albania and Northern Macedonia, you find quite a significant Bektashi community, which is sort of non-normative Sufi sect, if you want to call it that way. But very, very recent. So Sufism was part of the official, so to say, teachings of the Ottomans. And because of that, it reached the shores. Actually, there are people, there are historians who are saying that there were Sufi Muslims living in the areas of the Balkans, even prior, century or two prior to the Ottoman conquest of the Balkans. These were people who moved around, settled in certain places, lived their own, life of devotion and so on. Sometimes they would, preach to others, and some people would become Muslims. But obviously, with the coming of the Ottomans, that proliferated. And so, if you were a student in madrasa, for instance, the 16th or 17th century, in addition to all the other disciplines that you would study in order to become a religious scholar, you would also have to practice some sort of Sufi. You would have to have a Sufi practice, and so even in madrasa itself, there is what is called as khanqa or khanika, which was a place for the students to go into seclusion and see, but also to devote themselves to these devotional practices. So this was very much part of the milieu of the Eastern Islam, and definitely in the Balkans. Like I said, with the coming of communism, many of these Sufi orders had been decimated because this was seen as an activity that communists would not tolerate. So it was only within a very small number of people that Sufism survived. But now it's seen somewhat of a revival. So if you go, for instance, to Bosnia or to Northern Macedonia or to Kosovo today, you'll find many living Sufi people who devote themselves to Sufi philosophy and practice of Islam, and combine it with the Sunni normative Islam. So that was the kind of the Ottoman way, was that it always combined Sunni orthodoxy with the Sufi spirituality, and that was the synthesis that was part and informed the way of practicing Islam in the Balkans for a very long time. Like I said, many of these traditions had disappeared due to dramatic, turbulent changes that happened in the region. But in spite of that, some of these practices had survived, and there are living communities still there where you can go, for instance, to Sarajevo or to Zenica or to other places in the Balkans or in Bosnia, and find regular meeting the Sufi communities where they do their own devotional activities on a regular basis.
Yeah, echoing Dr. Farooq, fascinating answer. I was also unfamiliar with sort of the Sufi history there. We are a little short on time. If maybe room for one more question from the audience, if anyone has one. Because I do want to be mindful of everyone's time. I know for Professor Sinanovic, it's 10 o'clock on the East Coast, right?
Right.
So I do want to be mindful of your time. I'll give it a few seconds. Okay, yeah, I have one last question from Gail, and after that, we'll go ahead and wrap up. So they ask, I know this is a long shot. Is there any relation to the Muslims in Northern Cyprus? they seem to be more secular than Turkish Muslims, but do you have any thoughts or ideas about that?
I don't know much about the Muslims in Northern Cyprus. I mean, they're part of the larger Ottoman cultural sphere. Obviously, for certain historical reasons, Cyprus became divided between, the Greek part and the Turkish part, if you will. So it depends which part of Cyprus we're talking about, right? Obviously, there are not many Muslims left in the Greek part of Cyprus, but they have their own traditions that are informed by the Ottoman heritage, but because of historical geographical experience that they've had, I think they've developed, in general, a more secular outlook on life, which would not be dissimilar to the way that we see even in some parts of Turkey. As we know, Turkey has certain pockets that tend to be much more religious and conservative, and other pockets, for instance, closer to the western part of Turkey, that tend to be more, so they were more kind of in line with what we find also in Turkish Cyprus. But beyond that, I think there are other people who probably know that better than I do, so I'll stop in that.
Got it. Okay. Thank you, Professor. With that, I think we'll go ahead and wrap up. I do want to quickly, I should have done this earlier, but I'm going to drop your website link into the Zoom chat for everyone, and so they can learn more about you, learn more about the work that you're doing, the things that you're involved in, potentially reach out to you with any other questions. But with that, I want to thank everyone for spending the evening with us. I know I learned a lot from Professor, and I hope you all did as well. Thank you for sharing the space with us and engaging in this conversation. And of course, thank you, Professor Sinanovic, for gracing us with your expertise, with your knowledge, and with your care. I really appreciate it. And thank you so much, everyone, for coming. With that, that concludes my time as the Abbasi Markaz Fellow. Thank you, everyone who helped make this happen. Professor Farah, or Dr. Farah from the Abbasi program, Cassie from the Markaz, Dr. Abia from the Markaz, and of course to all of the guest speakers we had. Next year, there will be a new fellow with a new slate of events to come. So keep in touch with the Abbasi program and with Markaz for that. With that, thank you so much, everyone. We'll see you next time.
Thank you so much.